I stopped dating because every person I met made me wish I was with you. Then why did you wait until we were sharing one bed to tell me? Because tonight was the first time I thought you might feel it too. And if you are wrong, what happens to 11 years of friendship? Then tell me which scares you more, losing me or loving me.
Earlier that evening, I still believed 11 years of friendship made us completely safe. The trip itself had been Mason's idea. One of our college friends was getting married in a quiet mountain town about 400 miles from Chicago, and since both of us desperately needed a break from work, we decided to drive together instead of flying. Mason and I had met as college freshmen and had spent the year since becoming each other's emergency contacts, moving crews, holiday defaults, and first calls after difficult days. We had watched each other survive family crises, career mistakes, terrible apartments, and enough long drives to believe there was nothing left between us capable of becoming unfamiliar. That certainty was the reason I never considered the room dangerous. Mason claimed the road trip would give him new photography ideas. I claimed I simply wanted decent barbecue somewhere outside the city. The truth was simpler. Spending time with Mason had always been easy, comfortable, familiar. He had this rare ability to make silence feel complete instead of awkward. Somewhere over the years, he had become less like a friend and more like home, although I never stopped to question what that really meant. We checked into the hotel just after sunset. The lobby smelled faintly of cedarwood and fresh coffee, while soft jazz drifted through hidden speakers. Couples wandered through the lounge carrying wine glasses, laughing quietly, and families wheeled oversized suitcases toward the elevators. Everything about the place felt warm and welcoming until the receptionist frowned at her computer and delivered the warning I had tried to treat as a joke. A reservation error had left the hotel completely booked except for a single king room. She offered extra blankets, complimentary breakfast, and enough reward points for another stay, clearly expecting us to complain. Mason simply smiled. "Perfect," he repeated. "We've survived worse." I rolled my eyes and nodded. "Yeah. We're not exactly strangers." The receptionist handed us one key card and wished us a wonderful weekend. Neither of us noticed how strangely symbolic that single key would become. Room 814 overlooked a lake reflecting the orange glow of the setting sun. It was beautiful in the effortless way only small towns seemed capable of achieving. Then I noticed the bed. One bed. Large enough for two people, sure, but still one bed. Mason dropped his backpack onto the floor and looked at me with an exaggerated grin. "Don't fall in love with me tonight, Ethan." I laughed automatically. "You're safe." The joke should have disappeared into the room like every other joke we'd shared over the past decade. Instead, it lingered somewhere between us. Maybe it was because neither of us laughed quite as hard afterward. Maybe it was because, for the first time in years, I became strangely aware of how close we were standing. Or maybe it was because the room suddenly felt much quieter than it should have. I walked over to the window, pretending to admire the lake while my reflection stared back at me. Behind me, I could hear Mason humming softly as he unpacked his camera equipment. It was a sound I'd heard hundreds of times before, yet somehow that evening it carried a different weight. At the time, I blamed it on the long drive. I blamed it on exhaustion. I blamed it on everything except the truth. Because sometimes your heart recognizes something long before your mind is willing to admit it. Dinner that evening should have felt completely normal, but every ordinary moment seemed to carry an unexpected weight I could not explain. The little restaurant across the street overlooked the lake, with strings of warm lights hanging between old maple trees and the smell of grilled steak drifting through the cool mountain air. Mason insisted we eat outside, even though the temperature had already dropped into the low 60s. He said photographs always looked better when people were slightly cold because they smiled more honestly. That sounded exactly like something Mason would say, and I shook my head, pretending not to find it amusing even as I laughed. He had always been able to pull that reaction out of me. We ordered burgers, fries, and 2 glasses of iced tea. Nothing fancy, nothing memorable. Yet I can still remember every detail of that meal. The way he stole fries from my plate, even though he had ordered the larger basket. The way he reached across the table to brush a tiny leaf off my jacket without thinking twice. The way he smiled whenever he caught me watching him before quickly looking away toward the water. Those little habits had existed for years. I had simply stopped noticing them because they had become part of everyday life. That night, however, every familiar gesture seemed brighter, almost impossible to ignore. As we finished eating, a live acoustic guitarist began performing near the patio. Couples slowly drifted toward the open space beside the stage, swaying gently to old love songs neither of us had heard in years. Mason rested his elbows on the table and watched them with an easy smile. "Do you ever think about how strange life is?" he asked. "One day you are 20 years old, convinced you have everything figured out, and then suddenly everyone is getting married." I laughed softly. "Speak for yourself. I never had anything figured out." "That is true," he teased. "You still cannot decide what color to paint your own apartment. Neutral colors are timeless. Neutral colors are boring." We slipped back into the comfortable rhythm that had carried us through more than a decade of friendship. It was effortless, almost automatic. That was always our greatest strength. We never needed to impress each other. Silence never demanded to be filled. Conversation never felt forced. Somewhere between dessert and the walk back to the hotel, Mason pulled out his camera. He photographed the glowing street lights, the reflections on the lake, an old wooden bridge, and a stray golden retriever happily chasing ducks near the shoreline. Then he turned the camera toward me. "Do not," I warned, raising a hand. He grinned anyway. Too late. The shutter clicked. "Delete it." "Absolutely not. It is probably terrible." He glanced at the screen and smiled to himself. "Actually, it is one of my favorites." "You say that about every picture." "No," he replied quietly. "Just the ones that matter." His answer settled somewhere deep inside me before I could stop it. I brushed it away with another joke because that was easier than asking what he meant. When we returned to the room, the hallway was peaceful, broken only by the distant hum of the ice machine. Mason unlocked the door with the single key card, tossed it onto the dresser, and disappeared into the bathroom to shower. Left alone for the first time all evening, I sat on the edge of the bed and looked around the quiet room. Everything appeared exactly as it had a few hours earlier, yet something inside me had shifted ever so slightly. It was subtle enough to ignore, but impossible to erase. When Mason finally stepped back into the room wearing a simple gray sweatshirt and athletic pants, his damp hair falling across his forehead, he looked less like the adventurous photographer everyone admired and more like the same college kid who had once spent an entire night helping me study because he refused to let me fail an exam. I smiled without realizing it. He caught me immediately. "What?" he asked. "Nothing." I answered far too quickly. "You are smiling. Am I not allowed to smile? You usually only smile like that when you are remembering something." I looked away before he could read the truth on my face because I had just realized I was no longer remembering the past. I was quietly wondering what our future might look like, and that thought frightened me far more than sharing one hotel room ever could. The rain arrived without warning just after 10 o'clock, tapping softly against the wide hotel windows until the steady rhythm filled every corner of the room. Mason glanced outside and sighed with exaggerated disappointment. "There goes my plan to photograph the stars," he said as he set his camera carefully on the desk. "Looks like the universe has other ideas." I shrugged, pretending the weather did not matter to me. "You already took enough pictures to fill 3 memory cards today." He laughed. "There is no such thing as enough pictures." The television played quietly in the background, though neither of us paid much attention to it. We found ourselves talking instead, the way we always had, letting one conversation naturally lead into another. We laughed about our terrible freshman apartment where the heater barely worked during winter. We remembered surviving on frozen pizza because neither of us knew how to cook. Mason reminded me about the time I accidentally dyed all my white shirts light pink because I ignored the washing instructions. I reminded him about the photography contest where he confidently submitted the wrong file and somehow still won honorable mention because the judges thought his mistake was artistic. Every memory seemed to fit together like pieces of a puzzle that had been quietly forming for years. At one point, Mason disappeared into his backpack and pulled out a faded photograph. "You remember this?" he asked. I took it from his hand. It showed the two of us standing outside our college dorm during freshman orientation. We looked impossibly young, wearing oversized backpacks and nervous smiles that tried to hide how completely lost we felt. "Where did you even find this?" I asked. "I have carried it for years." "Years?" It reminds me where everything started. I looked at the worn edges of the picture. Somehow I had forgotten that day completely, yet Mason had preserved it like something precious. You really keep everything, I said. Only the important things. His answer was so simple that I almost missed its meaning. Outside, the rain grew heavier, turning the lake into a blur of silver ripples beneath the hotel lights. The weather forecast on the television warned about storms continuing through the night, recommending travelers stay indoors. Mason smiled as if hearing wonderful news. Perfect excuse for hot chocolate. 20 minutes later, we were sitting cross-legged on the carpet beside the window with paper cups warming our hands. The room lights were dim, leaving only the glow from a small lamp and the reflections dancing across the glass. There was something strangely peaceful about sharing that quiet space. Nobody expected anything from us. Nobody interrupted us. For the first time in what felt like years, life slowed down enough for both of us to simply exist without rushing toward tomorrow. Mason picked up his camera again. Smile. I groaned. Again. Trust me. He snapped another picture before lowering the camera and studying the screen. This time he did. Not tease me. Instead, he quietly turned the display toward himself and smiled in a way I had never seen before. It was softer, more thoughtful. What? I asked. Nothing. That is exactly what I said earlier. Now you know how frustrating it is. I reached over, trying to steal the camera, but he held it above his head, laughing. Our shoulders bumped as we struggled for a second before both of us froze. Neither of us had expected the sudden silence that followed. We were close enough to hear each other breathing, close enough to notice details we usually ignored, like the tiny freckle near his jaw or the faint laugh lines beside his eyes. After a long moment, Mason slowly lowered the camera without breaking eye contact. His smile faded into something quieter, something uncertain. Then his phone buzzed loudly on the table, breaking whatever invisible thread had settled between us. He glanced at the screen and frowned. It is Claire, my sister, he said. She saw the picture I posted from dinner and is asking if I have ever regretted not dating anyone seriously after college. He looked up at me with an amused expression. That is a strangely specific question. I forced a casual smile, even though something tightened unexpectedly inside my chest. So what are you going to tell her? Mason looked back down at the message, but instead of answering immediately, he remained unusually quiet, as though the question deserved far more thought than either of us had expected. For a long moment, Mason simply stared at Claire's message without typing a single word. The rain continued drumming softly against the windows, while the silence between us became heavier than either of us seemed willing to acknowledge. Finally, he locked his phone and placed it face down on the carpet. I will answer later, he said. I tried to sound casual. You still did not answer my question. He leaned back against the side of the bed and looked toward the rain-covered lake instead of at me. She asked if I regret never giving someone a real chance after college. I nodded slowly. That seems like a fair question. Does it? He asked with a faint smile. Maybe. Another quiet pause settled over us. So, I continued, trying not to sound too interested. Do you regret it? Mason let out a slow breath. Sometimes I wonder if I spent too much time waiting. His words landed somewhere deep inside me before I could stop them. Waiting for what? He shrugged lightly. The right moment. The right person. Maybe both. I looked down into my cup even though it had already gone cold. There was something about the way he answered that made it feel less like a conversation and more like a confession carefully disguised as one. Before I could think of another question, the lights flickered once. Then everything went dark. The gentle hum of the air conditioner disappeared, leaving only the steady sound of rain outside. Well, Mason laughed softly. That is unexpected. A few seconds later, emergency lights in the hallway cast a faint glow beneath the door, but the room itself remained wrapped in darkness. Mason reached into one of his camera bags and pulled out a small camping lantern that filled the room with a warm golden light. You seriously carry that everywhere? I asked. Photographers are professional overpackers. The soft light changed everything. The room suddenly felt smaller, quieter, almost disconnected from the rest of the world. There were no phone notifications, no television, no distractions. Just two lifelong friends sitting across from each other while the storm surrounded the hotel. Mason smiled thoughtfully. Want to play a game? That depends. One question each. Honest answers only. I laughed. You are borrowing this from those road trip movies. Maybe, but it beats staring at the ceiling. I agreed before realizing how dangerous honest conversations could become after midnight. Mason went first. What is your biggest fear? I answered without thinking. Waking up one day and realizing I let the important parts of life pass me by because I was too careful. His expression softened in a way I could not quite understand. That sounds lonely. Maybe it is. Then it was my turn. I searched for something harmless, something safe. Instead, the first question that escaped my mouth surprised even me. Have you ever been in love? Mason did not answer immediately. His eyes drifted toward the rain beyond the window before returning to mine. I think so, he said quietly. Only once. My heartbeat became strangely loud inside the silent room. What happened? He smiled, but it carried a sadness I had never noticed before. I never found the courage to tell him. The single word echoed in my thoughts. Mason had never spoken openly about who he might have loved, and I had never asked. Somehow, after all these years, we had danced around conversations like this without ever stepping into them. I wanted to ask another question. I wanted to know everything. Who he was. When it happened. Whether that person had loved him back. Instead, I remained completely still, afraid that moving even an inch might shatter the fragile honesty that had finally found its way between us. Mason gave a quiet laugh and rubbed the back of his neck. Your turn again, he said gently. I opened my mouth, but no words came. Because for the first time in 11 years, I realized I was no longer wondering whether my best friend had ever fallen in love. I was terrified that I might already know the answer, and even more terrified that I wanted that answer to be me. The question lingered between us long after neither of us spoke another word. Outside, the rain continued falling with the patient rhythm of a clock that had forgotten about time, while the small lantern painted soft shadows across the walls. Mason finally smiled, almost as if he regretted saying as much as he already had. Forget it, he said quietly. It was a long time ago. I nodded, but neither of us believed that was true. Some feelings did not belong to the past simply because years had passed. Some waited silently until the right moment finally arrived. Hoping to ease the tension, Mason reached for his camera again. I want to show you something, he said. He unlocked the memory card and began scrolling through hundreds of photographs collected over the years. There were mountain trails in Colorado, quiet beaches along the Oregon coast, crowded streets in New York, tiny coffee shops, sunrise hikes, old bridges, autumn forests, and dozens of unforgettable places he had visited. I smiled as familiar memories resurfaced with every image. You really have been everywhere, I said. Not everywhere. His eyes remained on the screen. Just the places that meant something. He handed me the camera so I could continue scrolling. At first, I barely noticed the pattern. Landscapes appeared between portraits, city skylines between family gatherings, and vacation snapshots mixed with professional work. Then something unexpected caught my attention. I appeared again. And again. Another photograph showed me laughing with a paper cup of coffee during a freezing morning in Boston. Another captured me asleep in the passenger seat halfway through a 12-hour drive. Another showed me standing beside a lake, completely unaware the picture had ever been taken. I kept scrolling. Birthdays, holidays, weekend trips, ordinary afternoons. Somehow I was everywhere. By then, the photographs had forced the truth into the open, and Mason had asked the one question I could not answer without changing US. I sat frozen with his camera in my hands, suddenly aware that silence was also a choice. My hands tightened around the camera. Every memory from the last 11 years seemed to rearrange itself all at once. The extra invitations, the spontaneous road trips, the photographs, the unwavering loyalty, the way he always seemed happiest when we were simply spending time together. None of it had been accidental. Before I could find the courage to respond, the lights suddenly flickered back to life. The room brightened instantly, washing away the warm glow of the lantern. Mason blinked, stood up almost too quickly, and cleared his throat. Looks like the power is back, he said, forcing an easy smile that did not quite reach his eyes. Then he gently took the camera from my hands and set it on the desk, leaving one photograph still glowing on the screen. It was the picture he had taken of me by the lake earlier that evening, and beneath it, hidden in the image title, were 5 simple words that changed everything I thought I understood. My favorite person, as always. Neither of us mentioned the words hidden beneath the photograph. Mason busied himself arranging camera lenses that were already perfectly organized, while I remained standing beside the desk, staring at the blank television screen because it was easier than looking directly at him. My thoughts refused to slow down. Every explanation I had relied on for more than a decade suddenly felt incomplete. I had always believed our friendship was extraordinary because we understood each other better than anyone else. Now I wondered if I had been reading only half the story all along. "It is getting late," Mason said gently without turning around. "We should probably get some sleep. We have the wedding tomorrow." "Yeah," I answered, though the word barely sounded like my own voice. We prepared for bed in unusual silence. Normally, we would have continued talking until one of us could barely keep our eyes open. But that night, every ordinary routine felt unfamiliar. I brushed my teeth while replaying every conversation from the evening. He folded an extra blanket and placed it neatly at the foot of the bed without making another joke. Even the playful comfort that had always existed between us seemed to have stepped back, waiting for one of us to decide what came next. Mason noticed me hesitating beside the bed and smiled. "I can take the floor," he offered. "You do not have to. The floor is fine." "Mason," he finally looked at me. "We have shared worse places than this. Remember sleeping in the airport after our flight was canceled?" A small laugh escaped before I could stop it. "Those chairs were terrible." "Exactly. Compared to that, this is luxury." The tension eased just enough for both of us to settle beneath opposite sides of the blanket, leaving an almost comical amount of space between us. The rain had finally stopped, replaced by the occasional sound of water dripping from the roof outside. The room was quiet again, but this silence felt different. It carried questions instead of comfort. I stared at the ceiling while sleep remained impossibly far away. After several minutes, Mason spoke into the darkness. "Ethan, yeah. If I made things awkward tonight, I am sorry." I turned my head toward him. The faint moonlight slipping through the curtains outlined his face just enough for me to see the uncertainty in his expression. I had almost forgotten that while I was trying to understand my own feelings, he had probably been worrying that he had just destroyed the most important friendship in his life. "You did not," I answered honestly. "I just need a little time to think." He nodded once. "That is fair." Neither of us said another word after that. Eventually, I heard his breathing become slow and steady, and I assumed he had fallen asleep. I wished it were that easy for me. Instead, I lay awake, watching pale streaks of moonlight move slowly across the ceiling. Every memory from the past 11 years returned with new meaning. The birthday gifts that somehow always arrived exactly when I needed encouragement. The countless weekends he rearranged his schedule just to help me move apartments or finish projects. The way he remembered every small detail about my family, my favorite coffee order, even the songs I skipped whenever they came on the radio. None of those things had demanded an explanation before. Now they did. Sometime before dawn, I quietly slipped out of bed, careful not to wake him, and walked onto the small balcony overlooking the lake. The air smelled fresh after the storm, and a thin layer of mist floated above the still water. The peaceful view should have cleared my thoughts, but instead it made one realization impossible to ignore. I was not afraid because Mason had admitted how deeply he cared about me. I was afraid because somewhere between that single hotel room, the old photographs, the rain, and the quiet honesty of one unforgettable night, I had begun searching my own heart for an answer, and for the first time in my life, I was no longer certain that friendship was the only thing I wanted from him. Morning arrived wrapped in golden sunlight, as though the storm had never happened. The lake outside the hotel was perfectly still, reflecting the bright blue sky with almost impossible clarity, but the calm scenery only made the confusion inside me feel louder. Mason was already awake when I stepped back into the room from the balcony. He stood by the coffee maker wearing the same relaxed smile that had always made unfamiliar places feel comfortable. "Good morning," he said naturally. I grabbed us coffee before the breakfast rush. For a second, I simply watched him. It amazed me that after revealing something so deeply personal, he was still trying to make my morning easier. "Thanks," I replied quietly, accepting the paper cup. Neither of us mentioned the conversation from the night before. Instead, we spoke about the wedding schedule, the weather, and whether the drive home would have traffic on Sunday. It was almost convincing. Almost. Every accidental glance lasted a little too long before one of us looked away. Every quiet pause carried words neither of us seemed ready to say. By late morning, we arrived at the lakeside venue where white flowers lined a wooden walkway leading toward the ceremony. Friends from college greeted us with hugs, laughter, and stories that made the years disappear for a while. More than once, someone smiled at Mason and me before asking the same familiar question we had heard for years. "So, are you two finally together yet?" Normally, Mason would answer first with an exaggerated laugh. "Nope, just best friends." I would roll my eyes, everyone would laugh, and the conversation would move on. This time, neither of us answered immediately. The silence lasted only a few seconds, but it felt much longer. I forced a smile and changed the subject while Mason quietly excused himself to help another friend carry decorations. As I watched him walk away, I realized something unsettling. For the first time, I wished I had answered that question differently. The ceremony itself was beautiful in its simplicity. The bride and groom stood beneath an old oak tree overlooking the lake, promising to choose each other every single day, no matter what life placed in front of them. I had attended plenty of weddings before, but those words reached me differently now. Love was not always dramatic. Sometimes it looked like remembering someone's favorite coffee, saving old photographs, driving hundreds of miles simply because spending time together mattered more than the destination. Without realizing it, I glanced toward Mason. He was already looking at me. Neither of us smiled. We simply held each other's gaze until the applause at the end of the ceremony gently broke the moment. During the reception, music drifted across the outdoor dance floor while guests celebrated beneath strings of warm lights. Mason spent much of the evening taking photographs for the happy couple after the hired photographer unexpectedly asked for an extra pair of hands. Watching him work reminded me why everyone admired him. He noticed details other people overlooked. The nervous smile before the first dance, parents quietly wiping away tears, children chasing bubbles across the grass. He captured feelings instead of poses. Later, while everyone gathered for dessert, I wandered toward the quiet edge of the lake. The sounds of laughter faded behind me until only the gentle breeze remained. I heard footsteps on the wooden dock before Mason stopped beside me. Neither of us spoke at first. Finally, he slipped both hands into his pockets and looked across the water. "I have been thinking," he admitted softly. "Maybe I should not have told you everything last night." I turned toward him. "Why?" He gave a small, understanding smile. "Because I care about you too much to ever risk making your life harder." His words should have made walking away easier. Instead, they revealed the truth I had been avoiding since the moment we checked into that hotel. I was never afraid of losing my best friend because he cared about me. I was afraid because somewhere along the way I had quietly fallen in love with him too, and admitting it meant accepting that after 11 years, nothing between us could ever honestly go back to the way it had been before. The breeze carried the sound of distant laughter across the lake, but on the quiet dock it felt as though the entire world had stepped back to give us a single moment alone. Mason kept his eyes fixed on the water, as if he had already accepted whatever answer I was about to give. I realized then that he was trying to protect me even now. If I told him I only wanted friendship, he would smile, apologize one last time, and spend the rest of his life pretending his heart had never slipped into the conversation. The thought hurt more than I expected. "You are not making my life harder," I said at last. He looked over, surprised by the steadiness in my voice. "Then why have you been so quiet?" I let out a slow breath. "Because I have been trying to understand why everything suddenly feels different." He nodded gently. "I understand." "No," I replied, shaking my head. "I do not think you do." I laughed softly, more at myself than anything else. "I spent the entire night convincing myself that what changed was you finally telling me how you felt." I paused before meeting his eyes again. "But that is not what changed." He remained completely still. "The truth is, you have always cared about me the same way. I was just too blind to see it." The afternoon sunlight reflected across the lake, making the water sparkle like thousands of tiny mirrors. I smiled as another realization settled into place. "Do you remember how quiet I was this morning?" He frowned slightly. "You barely said anything." "Exactly." I shook my head. "Because I was scared." "Scared of what?" "Not of losing my best friend." My voice became quieter. I was scared of discovering that every moment I thought was ordinary suddenly meant something completely different. Mason searched my face carefully, almost afraid to hope. "Ethan, when you showed me those photographs," I continued, "I kept wondering why you saved so many pictures of me." I smiled. Now I think I was asking the wrong question. What was the right question? Why did I never notice how often I was looking back at you? A warm breeze drifted between us. Somewhere behind the reception hall, guests applauded another wedding speech, but it sounded very far away. You have been my favorite part of almost every memory I have, I admitted. Every road trip, every birthday, every terrible apartment, every random Tuesday when nothing important happened. I laughed quietly. I kept calling those memories friendship because I never stopped long enough to ask myself why losing the idea of us suddenly felt unbearable. Mason's eyes glistened in the afternoon light, though his smile remained small and uncertain. Are you saying what I think you are saying? I nodded. I think I spent years believing I was protecting our friendship. Another deep breath escaped before I finally spoke the words that had been waiting inside me for far longer than one weekend. The truth is, I do not want to spend the rest of my life wondering what might have happened if I had been honest. Neither of us moved for several seconds. There was no dramatic music, no grand audience, no perfect speech waiting to be delivered. There were only two people who had quietly become the center of each other's lives without realizing the destination until they finally stopped running from it. Mason took one careful step closer, giving me every opportunity to step away if I wanted. Instead, I closed the remaining distance between us and wrapped him in a gentle embrace that felt as natural as every hug we had shared before, yet somehow completely new at the same time. He laughed softly against my shoulder, the kind of relieved laugh that only appears after carrying hope for far too long. So, he whispered, does this mean I finally get an honest answer? I smiled, pulling back just enough to look at him. Yes. My voice was calm, certain, and lighter than it had been in years. The room did not change us, Mason. It simply gave me enough quiet to hear what my heart had been trying to tell me all along. 1 year later, Mason and I found ourselves driving the same winding road back toward the little mountain town where everything had quietly fallen into place. The trip had become our promise to each other. No matter how busy work became or how complicated life tried to make things, we would always return for one weekend every year. The hotel looked exactly the same as I remembered. The cedar scent still drifted through the lobby, soft jazz still floated from hidden speakers, and the receptionist welcomed guests with the same warm smile. This time, however, there was no reservation mistake waiting for us. Mason reached into his wallet and handed over our confirmation. Room 814, please, he said with an unmistakable grin. The receptionist smiled. You requested it months ago. We definitely did, I replied. Mason looked at me with the same quiet expression that had become so familiar over the past year, and I realized how much life could change without losing the simple things that mattered most. We still laughed over terrible jokes during long drives. He still stole fries from my plate whenever we went out to eat. I still pretended to complain every time he pointed his camera at me, even though I secretly loved seeing the world through his eyes. The biggest difference was not the labels we used for our relationship. It was the freedom that came from no longer hiding our hearts behind fear. We unlocked the door together and stepped into the room where an ordinary weekend had rewritten our future. The furniture had been updated, the curtains were a different color, and a new painting hung above the bed, yet the feeling remained exactly the same. Mason walked toward the window overlooking the lake while I noticed something resting on the small desk beside a welcome card. It was a simple wooden key holder decorated with the hotel's logo. I smiled as I carefully placed our room key inside it. You know, Mason said as he looked out across the water, I used to think this room changed everything. I walked over to stand beside him. Do you still think that? He shook his head with a thoughtful smile. No, I think it simply gave us a reason to stop pretending. I slipped my hand into his, and he held it with the same quiet certainty that had always existed between us long before either of us found the courage to name what we felt. Outside, a few guests wandered along the lakeside path while children laughed near the dock, where we had once shared the most important conversation of our lives. Everything felt peaceful, familiar, and wonderfully ordinary. That evening we walked through town, revisiting the little restaurant where we had shared burgers and iced tea, the bridge where Mason had taken photographs, and the dock where I had finally admitted the truth to myself. At sunset, he lifted his camera once again. One more picture, he said. I laughed. You have thousands already. Not enough. I smiled exactly the way I always did whenever he said that. The shutter clicked, and he glanced at the screen before turning it toward me. It was a simple photograph of the two of us reflected in the calm water behind us, smiling without trying to pose. Beneath the image title, he had typed 5 different words this time. Home has always been here. I looked at him, unable to stop smiling. I think that is your best one yet. He slipped the camera back over his shoulder. It is my favorite because it tells the truth. As the last light settled across the lake, I realized that people often spend years searching for the moment that changes their lives, expecting something dramatic or impossible to miss. But sometimes the greatest turning point begins with a small inconvenience, a shared room, an honest conversation, and the courage to stop running from what has quietly been true all along. Looking back now, I no longer remember that weekend as the time when 2 best friends became something more. I remember it as the weekend when 2 people finally gave themselves permission to recognize that love had been patiently waiting inside an extraordinary friendship from the very beginning.